The Bunker Chronicles by Michael Hunt, Chapter 1, January 15th, 2020. The perfectly reasonable decision, Herbert Wilkinson, who preferred to be called Herb because it made him sound more like a friendly seasoning than a man with 3 separate spreadsheets tracking potential apocalypse scenarios, was having what he considered to be an entirely sensible thought. The kind of thought that, when explained to others at dinner parties, tended to make them suddenly remember urgent appointments elsewhere. "It's really the only logical thing to do," he explained to his ficus plant, which had the decency not to argue. "Test the systems before they're actually needed." The bunker beneath Herb's modest suburban home had cost him approximately the same as a luxury sports car, but offered considerably less opportunity to impress women and significantly more protection from nuclear fallout. It was his pride and joy, a fact he typically kept to himself after his date with Cynthia from accounting had ended abruptly when he'd enthusiastically offered to show her his underground contingency solution. Herb carefully checked his supplies, 6 months of freeze-dried everything, water purification systems, medical supplies, a small but respectable library of paperbacks, mostly post-apocalyptic fiction, which he considered to be more reference material than entertainment, and enough batteries to power a small city of flashlights. He had installed solar panels on his roof, connected to a sophisticated battery system in the bunker with a backup generator for emergencies. The bunker entrance was concealed behind what appeared to be a storage shelf in his basement, which slid aside with a satisfying mechanical whir that always made Herb feel like a budget Batman. 2 weeks, he told the ficus, which he had decided would accompany him on this trial run, just to make sure everything works as expected. That's all this is. The ficus, predictably, kept its opinions to itself. Meanwhile, on the other side of town, Channel 7 news anchor Diane Holloway was applying another layer of makeup before going live with what she considered to be yet another hyperbolic health scare that would be forgotten by next week. "And we're back in 5, 4, 3. The floor director mouthed the final numbers. "Good evening. Reports are coming in about a new respiratory illness in China that has health officials monitoring the situation. While experts say there is no cause for immediate concern, the World Health Organization is." In the production booth, Jerry sipped his coffee. $10 says, "This blows over faster than that bird flu thing." "You're on," said Marge, not looking up from her phone. "My sister's a nurse, and she says this one feels different." "They all feel different until they're not," Jerry replied, adjusting the audio levels slightly. "Remember SARS?" Back in his home, Herb was watching this exact broadcast with the intense focus of a man who had been waiting his entire adult life for confirmation that his paranoia was actually prudence. He scribbled notes furiously. "Respiratory illness. China. Officials monitoring," he muttered, connecting invisible dots with the practiced ease of someone who had a corkboard with actual string connecting newspaper clippings in his home office. "It's beginning." He looked at his bunker entrance with something approaching affection. The timing of his test run suddenly seemed less random and more like the universe sending him a personal notification. 2 weeks, he repeated to himself, though something in his tone suggested he wasn't entirely convinced of this time frame anymore. Just to be safe, Herb made one final trip to the grocery store where he bought additional supplies with the casual air of someone who definitely wasn't preparing for the end of civilization. The teenage cashier barely looked up from his phone as he scanned 17 cans of beans, 12 packages of batteries, and 8 bottles of hand sanitizer. "Having a party?" the cashier asked with profound disinterest. "Something like that," Herb replied, suppressing the urge to warn the young man about his imminent doom. On January 15th, at precisely 9:17 p.m., Herbert Wilkinson entered his bunker, sealed the entrance, and settled in for what he genuinely believed would be a 2-week stay. The ficus was positioned near one of the artificial light sources he had installed at considerable expense. "Well," he said to the plant in the empty room, "here we go." He had no way of knowing that the next time he would see the sun, people would be arguing about whether Taylor Swift was actually a time traveler and cars would be driving themselves with varying degrees of success. Chapter 2, March 3, 2020. The first sign of trouble. Herb's 2-week test run had extended itself with a casual disregard for plans that time often exhibits when humans try to impose their will upon it. It had been 48 days, and Herb was beginning to think that perhaps he had been right all along. His small television, connected to an antenna that snaked its way up through a carefully disguised vent to the surface, had been broadcasting increasingly alarming news. Words like quarantine, pandemic, and unprecedented floated through the airwaves with alarming frequency. Herb found himself nodding sagely at the screen, like a man who had bet on a particularly unpopular horse and was now watching it thunder toward the finish line. "What did I tell you?" he asked the ficus, which had neither agreed nor disagreed with any of his previous statements but was looking slightly less perky than when their underground adventure had begun. The signs were all there. He had established a routine that would have made any efficiency expert proud. Mornings began with a systems check, followed by breakfast, reconstituted eggs on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, oatmeal on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and a special treat of freeze-dried fruit and powdered milk on weekends. He exercised for precisely 47 minutes, read for 2 hours, monitored radio frequencies, updated his journal, and allowed himself exactly 1 hour of television news per day to avoid what he called apocalypse fatigue. Today's news had included something about schools closing and people panic buying toilet paper, which Herb found both vindicating and slightly amusing, given that he had calculated his toilet paper needs with mathematical precision 3 years earlier. "Amateurs," he muttered, making a note in his journal. Outside Herb's underground sanctuary, Samantha Sam Johnson was having what she considered to be a perfectly normal day delivering mail, despite the new bottle of hand sanitizer clipped to her belt and the growing number of people who leapt back from their doors when she approached. "Morning, Mrs. Pemberton," Sam called to the elderly woman who served as the neighborhood's self-appointed lawn enforcement officer. Gladys Pemberton, president of the Sunny Meadows Homeowners Association for 17 consecutive years, running unopposed for the last 12, as no one else wanted the job or to deal with Gladys if they took it from her, was standing at the edge of Herbert Wilkinson's property with an expression that suggested she had just discovered someone had replaced all the neighborhood's grass with plastic replicas. "Have you seen this?" she demanded, gesturing dramatically at Herb's lawn, which had grown to the rebellious length of approximately 2¼ inches. "It's been like this for weeks now." "Weeks?" Sam glanced at the lawn, which looked to her untrained eye like every other lawn on the street, only slightly less regimented. "Looks fine to me, Mrs. Pemberton." "Fine. Fine." Gladys's voice achieved a pitch that made nearby dogs consider a career change to cats. "It's 17% longer than the HOA bylaws permit, and there's a dandelion. By the mailbox." Sam nodded sympathetically while sliding Mr. Wilkinson's mail into his box. There were several official-looking envelopes with the HOA logo prominently displayed, which she suspected contained increasingly stern warnings about the lawn situation. "Maybe he's sick," Sam suggested. "Lots of people are these days. Sickness is no excuse for neighborhood degradation," Gladys sniffed. "The bylaws clearly state that homeowners are responsible for maintaining standards regardless of personal circumstances. There are services one can hire." Sam, who had developed the ability to tune out OA complaints the way sailors tune out seagulls, nodded again and continued her route, leaving Gladys to her contemplation of grass-based injustice. Back in the bunker, Herb was unaware that his absence from lawn maintenance duties had been noted and documented in triplicate. He was busy analyzing the latest news broadcasts and adding to his increasingly complex wall chart that tracked what he believed to be the collapse of society. "Interesting that they're still broadcasting at all," he said to the ficus. "Must be running on emergency protocols. I give it another month before it's nothing but static." The plant, which was developing a distinctly yellowish tinge despite the expensive growing lights, offered no contradiction. Herb had begun to consider extending his stay indefinitely. His supplies were holding up well, his systems were functioning as designed, and the outside world seemed to be confirming his worst predictions on an hourly basis. "I think we made the right call," he told the ficus, patting its pot affectionately. "Better down here than up there with the panic and the virus and the toilet paper wars." He made a note in his journal, day 48. Decision to remain in bunker validated by external events. Will reassess situation in April, but preliminary analysis suggests surface return date may need to be pushed to summer or beyond. That night, as he lay on his reasonably comfortable bunker bed, Herb felt a sense of satisfaction that few people ever experience, the deep, soul-warming contentment of someone who has spent years being called paranoid only to be proven catastrophically right. Chapter 3. April 17th, 2020. The darkness falls. The day the lights went out in Herb's bunker was, coincidentally, the same day he had planned to conduct a routine test of his backup power systems. This coincidence would have been more comforting if he had actually been the one to initiate the power outage. He was in the middle of his morning constitutional, which consisted of walking in increasingly smaller circles around his bunker while listening to a cassette tape of nature sounds. The chirping birds now seemed like mocking reminders of a world he might never see again, when the lights flickered once, twice, and then surrendered to darkness with the finality of a stage curtain dropping on a particularly unpopular performance. The emergency lights kicked in immediately, bathing everything in a red glow that made his bunker look like either a submarine in crisis or a very unsexy photography darkroom. "Right on schedule," Herb said to the darkness, his voice betraying only the slightest quaver. Society's power grid has finally collapsed. The ficus, now sporting only 7 leaves and what appeared to be a growing resentment toward its caretaker, sat in the red glow like a plant that had seen better days and expected to see worse ones. Herb moved with practiced efficiency to his control panel, where various gauges and meters told him what he already knew: the main power was gone, and his bunker had switched to the battery backup system, which was currently being fed by the solar panels on his roof. The system was designed to prioritize essential functions: air filtration, water purification, and minimal lighting. His television, microwave, and the special air circulation system for his bedroom were now classified as luxury items from a bygone era. "We've prepared for this," he told the ficus, which had not in fact been consulted during any of the preparation phases. "The backup generator gives us another 3 months if the solar panels fail. By then..." He trailed off, the implications hanging in the air like the dust particles now visible in the beam of his flashlight. Above ground, Dave Kowalski was having what he considered to be the worst day of his career at Midwest Power and Light. He had joined the company 23 years ago with the simple desire to keep the electricity flowing and avoid paperwork. Today, he was doing neither. "I hate this part of the job," he muttered to himself as he stood at the meter of 47 Maple Drive. "Absolutely hate it." The clipboard in his hand held a disconnection order for one Herbert Wilkinson, who had, apparently, ignored 6 notices, 4 emails, 3 phone calls, and 1 very awkward in-person visit from the accounts department. The final notice had been delivered 2 weeks ago, and company policy was clear: no payment, no power. Dave sighed and looked at the house, which had an abandoned feel to it, despite being in generally good repair. Apart from the lawn that was now approaching what the neighborhood kids would call jungle status, the grass was long enough that Dave briefly wondered if he might encounter some new species of wildlife on his way to the meter. "Hello?" He called half-heartedly at the front door, knowing there would be no answer. The accounts department had already tried that route multiple times. Midwest Power and Light. Anyone home? The house remained as silent as his teenage son when asked about his future plans. With another heavy sigh, Dave made his way through the increasingly impressive grassland to the side of the house where the power meter and main connection were located. He placed the official company notice in a waterproof sleeve and attached it to the meter before pulling out his tools. "Sorry, buddy," he said to the empty house as he disconnected the power. Rules are rules. As he walked back to his truck, Dave couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, though. A quick glance at the windows showed nothing but reflections of clouds and the occasional bird. It was probably just the guilt, he decided. Nobody liked being the guy who turned off someone's power, especially during what people had taken to calling. These uncertain times, which Dave thought was a remarkably understated way of saying global disaster. Back in the bunker, Herb was already adapting to what he called Phase 2, post-to-grid survival. He had dimmed the emergency lights to conserve power and was calculating how long his supplies would last with this new development. The good news, he informed the ficus, which continued its steadfast commitment to being a plant, is that we're well positioned compared to those who failed to prepare. The solar panels should provide enough power for essential functions, as long as they remain undamaged by whatever's happening up there. He paused, considering the possibilities with the methodical thoroughness of someone who had mentally rehearsed apocalypse scenarios the way others practice golf swings. Best case, temporary grid failure due to maintenance issues or rolling blackouts. Worst case, complete infrastructure collapse, possibly due to mass casualties or societal breakdown. He made a note in his journal by the light of a battery-powered lamp. Day 93. Power grid has failed as predicted. Implementing conservation protocols. Will monitor for any radio transmissions that might indicate the scope of the collapse. If none are detected within 72 hours, must assume worst-case scenario. That night, Herb lay in his bed, listening to the hum of the air filtration system that was keeping him alive. The darkness seemed more complete than it had ever been before, as if the absence of power in the world above had somehow made the darkness in his bunker more potent, more meaningful. This is what we prepared for, he whispered to himself, a mantra that was becoming as much a comfort as a validation. This is why we're here. In the quiet of his underground sanctuary, Herb didn't feel fear so much as a strange sense of purpose. The world above might be in chaos, but down here, in his carefully constructed ark, he would survive. And when the time came to emerge, he would be ready to help rebuild whatever remained of civilization, assuming, of course, that there was anything left to rebuild. Chapter 4, July 8, 2020. Voices from Beyond. The first time Herb heard the noises from above, he was in the middle of what he had grandly termed his daily constitutional, which involved walking precisely 17 laps around the perimeter of his bunker while listening to a cassette tape titled Sounds of the Amazon Rainforest. The irony of simulating a walk through one of Earth's most expansive natural environments while circling a space roughly the size of a two-car garage was not lost on him, but he found that irony, like fresh vegetables and human contact, was something one could learn to live without. The sound was faint at first, a scraping that might have been mistaken for a quirk of the ventilation system if Herb hadn't memorized every wheeze, hum and rattle of his underground domain the way some people memorize the birthdays of distant relatives. This was something new, something from outside. Herb froze mid-stride, his right foot hovering above the floor like a flamingo having second thoughts about its life choices. The cassette player continued to emit the cheerful chirping of birds that had no idea. Their recorded songs were being played in what was essentially an elaborate tomb. There it was again, a definite scraping, followed by a thump that seemed to come from directly overhead. "They're here," Herb whispered to the ficus, which had by now lost all but 3 of its leaves and resembled less a plant than a sad stick hoping to be put out of its misery. The scavengers, or worse. He moved with the careful precision of a man who believes his next action might determine whether he lives or dies, which, to be fair, is how Herb approached most activities, including selecting breakfast cereals. He turned off the cassette player, plunging the bunker into a silence so complete it seemed to have physical weight. The sounds continued, scraping, an occasional thump, and now what might have been voices, though too muffled to make out words. Herb's mind raced through possibilities with the frantic energy of a squirrel on espresso. Looters? Government agents? Mutants? The last option seemed least likely but most interesting, so naturally it was the one his brain chose to focus on. "They won't find us," he assured the ficus in a whisper that suggested he wasn't entirely convinced of this himself. "The entrance is concealed and the ventilation system is disguised as old plumbing. We're safe." The ficus, having long ago abandoned any pretense of caring about human concerns, continued its slow march toward plant death with dignified resignation. Above ground, Gladys Pemberton was leading what she considered to be a perfectly reasonable inspection of the Wilkinson property, accompanied by a bank representative and a county clerk, who both looked like they would rather be anywhere else, including possibly an active volcano. "As you can see," Gladys was saying, gesturing at the lawn that had now evolved into something that might qualify for its own ecosystem classification, "the property has been completely abandoned. We've had no response to any notices, and the HOA bylaws clearly state that after 6 months of non-compliance and non-response, we can initiate proceedings." Martin Chen, the bank representative, nodded with the weary acceptance of a man who had seen this scenario play out countless times in the past few months. "The mortgage is 4 months delinquent, so the bank has already begun foreclosure proceedings. We'll need to conduct an interior inspection to assess the property condition." The county clerk, whose name badge identified her as Denise, but who had introduced herself as just here to document, was taking photos of the exterior, with an expression that suggested she had documented far worse properties and found this particular assignment barely worth the effort of raising her camera. "The key should work," Gladys said, producing a copy from her purse with the slightly smug satisfaction of someone who has acquired something they shouldn't technically have. "As HOA president, I maintain copies for emergency access. It's in the bylaws." Martin chose not to comment on the dubious legality of this arrangement, having learned long ago that questioning HOA practices was like questioning a religion in its own temple, technically allowed but likely to result in being asked to leave. The key turned smoothly in the lock, and the trio entered a house that was remarkably unremarkable. Everything was tidy, if dusty. There were no signs of hasty departure, no overturned furniture or evidence of struggle that might explain the owner's disappearance. It was as if Herbert Wilkinson had simply stepped out for a moment and forgotten to return for several months. "Let's check the basement," Martin suggested after they had toured the main floor. "Water damage usually shows up there first, and we need to document any issues before the property goes to auction." As they descended the stairs, their footsteps echoed on the wooden steps, creating the very sounds that, unknown to them, were causing Herb to contemplate which of his kitchen implements might be repurposed as weapons against mutant intruders. "Surprisingly clean," Denise commented, snapping photos of the basement, which contained the usual assortment of storage shelves, old paint, cans, and the odd piece of forgotten exercise equipment that seems to migrate to basements through some mysterious force of nature. "What's behind here?" Martin asked, approaching a large storage shelf that appeared to be built into the wall. "Probably just access to the foundation or plumbing," Gladys replied, already losing interest. Now that it was clear there would be no dramatic discoveries to report at the next HOA meeting, they completed their inspection without incident, unaware that just a few feet away, separated by concrete and steel, Herbert Wilkinson was pressed against the wall of his bunker with a can opener clutched in his trembling hand, listening to what he was convinced were the guttural communications of post-apocalyptic mutants planning their assault on his sanctuary. After the mutants departed, Herb spent hours analyzing the sounds he had heard, creating elaborate theories about what might be happening in the world above. His journal entry that evening was particularly extensive. Day 175, first contact with surface dwellers since the collapse. Vocal patterns suggest mutation or possibly radiation effects on speech organs. Numbers unclear. Detected at least 3 distinct voices. They appear to be scavenging for supplies or possibly seeking shelter. Must remain vigilant. Have repositioned emergency supplies for quick access in case of breach. Will implement noise discipline protocols effective immediately. The noise discipline protocols primarily involved wearing socks at all times, whispering, even when alone, and limiting his constitutional to the carpeted areas of the bunker. He also decided to conduct his daily systems check during what he estimated to be peak daylight hours, when any surface dwellers would presumably be occupied with whatever activities post-apocalyptic mutants engaged in during the day. That night, As Herb lay in bed staring at the ceiling, he found himself both terrified and oddly exhilarated by the day's events. After months of isolation, the confirmation that there was still life above, even potentially mutated life, was strangely comforting. "We're not alone," he whispered to the darkness, a statement that would have been more reassuring if he had been entirely certain that being alone was worse than the alternative. Chapter 5. December 12th, 2020. The first transition. Herb had become acutely aware of changes in his environment that he couldn't explain, which was particularly troubling for a man who had built his underground lifestyle around the principle that everything should be explainable, preferably with a spreadsheet and at least one pie chart. It had started with the vibrations, subtle at first, like the distant rumble of thunder, but growing more pronounced over weeks. Then came the periodic thumping from above, different from the footsteps he had catalogued months earlier. These were rhythmic, persistent, and maddening in their regularity. Most disturbing of all were the changes in the air quality. Despite his sophisticated filtration system, new smells occasionally wafted through the ventilation, unfamiliar. Chemicals, dust, and once, most perplexingly, what he could have sworn was fresh paint. "They're settling in," Herb informed the ficus, which had now completely given up any pretense of being alive and stood as a brittle monument to vegetative despair. He had continued to water it nonetheless, partly out of habit, and partly because admitting the plant was dead felt uncomfortably symbolic. "The surface dwellers are establishing some sort of colony directly above us." He had taken to pressing a drinking glass against the ceiling in different locations, listening intently for clues about the activities overhead. Today, he had distinctly heard what sounded like drilling, followed by a series of thuds that suggested something heavy being moved. "Construction," he muttered, making notes in his journal. "But what are they building? Shelters? Defenses? Some kind of primitive post-collapse infrastructure?" The most logical explanation: that someone had purchased his foreclosed home and was renovating it, never entered Herb's mind, having been crowded out by far more elaborate theories involving mutant communes, government research facilities, and, on particularly creative days, alien observation posts. Trevor Williams was having what he considered to be a perfectly reasonable meltdown about the state of his newly purchased fixer-upper. "You said it needed cosmetic work," he shouted into his phone, pacing across the dust-covered living room where a contractor was removing what appeared to be the world's ugliest wallpaper. "This isn't cosmetic. The electrical system is from the 1970s. There's a weird smell in the basement that 3 different cleaning services couldn't identify. And now you're telling me the plumbing needs to be completely redone." Barbara Fletcher, the real estate agent whose commission on this particular sale was rapidly being consumed by antacids and stress management audiobooks, maintained her professional tone with the determination of someone clinging to a cliff edge with freshly manicured nails. "Trevor, honey, we discussed that the home inspection found some issues that would need addressing. The seller disclosure clearly stated the seller didn't disclose anything because the seller wasn't there. It was a bank foreclosure, Barbara. The disclosure form had more blank spaces than a kindergarten spelling test." This was, unfortunately, true. Herbert Wilkinson's abrupt disappearance and subsequent mortgage default had resulted in a foreclosure sale with minimal information about the property's condition. Trevor had purchased the house at what seemed like a bargain price, only to discover that the universe maintains its cosmic balance by ensuring that no real estate deal is ever actually a bargain. "Look," Trevor continued, lowering his voice as the contractor glanced in his direction, "I just need to know if any of this is covered by the home warranty you insisted would protect my investment." The silence on the other end of the line spoke volumes, none of them bestsellers in the category of good news. "I'll check the policy language," Barbara finally replied, in the tone of someone who already knew exactly what the policy language said but was hoping to end the conversation before having to admit it. After hanging up, Trevor surveyed the chaos of his new home with the resigned expression of a man who has just realized he has made a terrible mistake, but is too stubborn to admit it. The contractors had removed sections of drywall to access the ancient wiring, torn up carpeting to reveal hardwood floors that had seen better days, possibly during the Lincoln administration, and discovered that what had appeared to be a small water stain in the kitchen ceiling was actually evidence of a leak that had been slowly creating its own ecosystem within the walls. "How's it going with the basement?" Trevor asked Miguel, the electrical contractor who had spent the morning staring at the breaker box with the expression of an archaeologist who had discovered a previously unknown civilization. "Weird," Miguel replied, which was not the professional assessment Trevor had hoped for. "The wiring down there doesn't match the rest of the house. Newer, but installed by someone who either didn't know code or didn't care. And there's a circuit I can't figure out. Doesn't connect to anything I can find. Is it dangerous?" Miguel shrugged. "Not immediately. But I'd recommend replacing the whole panel. And there's something else, some kind of metal conduit behind the storage shelves that doesn't show up in any of the original house plans." Trevor sighed, the deep soul-weary sigh of a man watching his renovation budget evaporate like morning dew in the Sahara. Add it to the list. Back in his bunker, Herb was conducting what he called a strategic resource assessment, which involved counting his remaining supplies and looking concerned. The vibrations from above had disrupted several of his carefully organized storage shelves, causing a cascade of canned goods that had nearly concussed him and definitely bruised both his shin and his dignity. "They're becoming more aggressive," he informed his journal, which had become less a record of events and more a confidant in his increasingly isolated existence. "The surface colony is expanding. Their activities suggest they're establishing permanent structures." He had begun to notice other changes as well. The temperature in the bunker fluctuated more than it should, and occasionally the lights dimmed without explanation. Most concerning was the water pressure, which had decreased noticeably in the past week. "Resource competition," he muttered, making another note. They must have tapped into the same groundwater source. Clever, or just lucky. That night, as Herb lay in bed listening to the strange symphony of creaks, thuds, and distant voices that filtered through his ceiling, he found himself wondering what the surface dwellers looked like. In his mind, they had evolved into pale, hairless creatures with oversized eyes adapted to the post-apocalyptic gloom, something like the unholy offspring of a mole rat and an anime character. The reality that Trevor Williams was directly above him, wearing Star Wars pajamas, and arguing with his girlfriend about whether they should have purchased a turnkey condo instead of this money pit, would have been far more disturbing to Herb than any mutant fantasy his imagination could conjure. Chapter 6, August 30th, 2021. The Great Silence. The day the noises stopped, Herb was in the middle of a heated argument with his toaster. This was not, it should be noted, because Herb had descended into madness after nearly 20 months of isolation, or at least not entirely because of that. It was because the toaster had developed a personality quirk that Herb found particularly vexing. It had taken to ejecting his carefully rationed bread slices with such enthusiasm that they often became airborne, landing on the floor which, despite his rigorous cleaning schedule, he considered to be fundamentally contaminated by virtue of being the lowest point in his living space. "It's a simple mechanism," Herb was explaining to the toaster with the strained patience of a kindergarten teacher on the last day before summer break. "You heat the bread, and then you raise it to a reasonable height. There is no need for this theatrical launching." The toaster, being an inanimate object with neither consciousness nor a particular interest in bread trajectory, offered no defense. It was during this one-sided debate that Herb suddenly realized something had changed. He tilted his head, listening with the intense concentration of someone trying to identify a single instrument in a symphony orchestra. Silence, complete silence from above. For months, he had grown accustomed to the constant soundtrack of the surface dwellers, their movements, their machinery, their incomprehensible activities. That sometimes continued well into what Herb had designated as night, despite having no actual reference for day-night cycles anymore. The silence was sudden and absolute, as if someone had muted the world above. "They're gone," he whispered to the toaster, which continued to exist without comment. But why? Where would they go? Herb's mind, which had developed a remarkable capacity for generating worst-case scenarios during his underground tenure, immediately produced several possibilities, each more alarming than the last. 1. The surface had become uninhabitable, forcing the colony to migrate. 2. They had been attacked by a rival group and either fled or been eliminated. 3. They had detected his presence and were now preparing for a coordinated assault on his bunker. 4. The government had reclaimed the area for some nefarious purpose. 5. Aliens. The last possibility was admittedly a stretch, but after 20 months in a bunker, Herb felt he had earned the right to include extraterrestrial intervention on his list of potential apocalypse scenarios. What Herb couldn't know was that Trevor Williams had indeed abandoned the house above, but for reasons far more mundane than alien intervention. After 9 months of escalating renovation costs, a relationship that couldn't survive the stress of home ownership, and the final straw, a colony of raccoons discovered living in the attic, Trevor had thrown in the towel. He had accepted a job offer in another state, listed the half-renovated house, with a new real estate agent, Barbara Fletcher, having mysteriously developed a medical condition that prevented her from taking his calls, and departed with the bitter wisdom of someone who would be renting apartments for the foreseeable future. The house at 47 Maple Drive now stood empty, a for sale sign swaying gently in the front yard, which had been professionally landscaped as part of Trevor's desperate attempt to recoup some of his investment. The interior was a strange patchwork of completed renovations and abandoned projects. New hardwood floors in the living room but exposed subfloor in the dining area, a gleaming modern kitchen adjacent to a bathroom with plastic sheeting instead of a shower door, fresh paint throughout the main level, but primer only in the bedrooms. The basement, which had continued to confound every contractor who entered it, remained largely untouched. The mysterious circuit in the electrical panel had been disconnected but not removed, labeled simply, "Unknown." Do not connect with the kind of tape that suggested whoever wrote it really meant it. The house would remain in this limbo state for months, shown occasionally to prospective buyers who invariably asked the same question, "What's with the basement?" To which the new real estate agent, having learned nothing from Barbara, his experience would reply, "It just needs a little cosmetic work." Back in the bunker, Herb had developed a new theory about the surface dwellers, disappearance, which he was explaining to his council of advisors. The council consisted of the dead ficus, now serving as a coat rack, the rebellious toaster, a flashlight with an intermittent flicker that Herb had, interpreted as a form of Morse code, and a volleyball with a face drawn on it that he had named Spaulding after finding it in his sports equipment storage box. They must have detected radiation spikes, Herb informed the council gravely, or perhaps a new pathogen, something that forced an immediate evacuation. Spaulding stared back with its permanent marker smile, offering neither confirmation nor denial. "The question is," Herb continued, pacing in a tight circle that had worn a visible path in the carpet, "does their departure make it safer for us to consider surface reconnaissance or more dangerous?" The flashlight flickered, which Herb interpreted as a vote for caution. "You're right," he agreed, nodding at the flashlight with the deference one might show a respected elder. "We don't have enough information. Better to maintain our current protocols and monitor for any signs of return." The truth was that Herb had grown comfortable in his underground world, despite its limitations. The idea of venturing to the surface, once the ultimate goal of his survival plan, had become increasingly abstract, like a retirement dream that one plans for but secretly suspects will never arrive. His journal entry that evening was uncharacteristically philosophical. Day 593. The surface colony has departed without explanation. The silence is both a relief and a new kind of burden. I find myself missing the evidence of their existence, as intrusive as it sometimes was. It was proof that life continues, that humanity, or whatever they have become, persists. Now, I am truly alone again. a solitary observer of an apocalypse I can no longer see or hear, but only imagine. Spaulding suggests we should celebrate with the emergency chocolate rations. The toaster, predictably, disagrees. That night, as Herb lay in his bed listening to the hum of his air filtration system, the only sound in his increasingly insular world, he found himself humming a tune he couldn't quite place, something from before. The melody drifted through his mind like a visitor from another life, familiar yet strange, a ghost of the world he had left behind. Above him, the empty house settled into its own kind of silence, creaking occasionally as old houses do, speaking a language that neither Herb nor any potential buyer could quite understand. Chapter 7. March 15th, 2022. The Second Coming. The return of the surface dwellers began with a sound that Herb initially mistook for a hallucination. After months of complete silence from above, the sudden slam of what could only be a door sent him scrambling from his makeshift desk, a repurposed storage container, with such force that he knocked over Spaulding, who rolled accusingly across the floor before coming to rest against the defunct refrigerator. "Did you hear that?" Herb whispered to the empty room, then immediately felt foolish for asking. Of course no one had heard it. No one except him, Spaulding, who lacked ears, the toaster, which lacked everything, except an inexplicable vendetta against bread, and the flashlight, which had finally surrendered to entropy 2 weeks earlier, taking with it what Herb had come to think of as the council's voice of reason. The sound came again, a definite door closing, followed by footsteps. Not the heavy, purposeful strides of the previous occupants, but lighter, more measured steps. Multiple sets, moving in different directions. Herb pressed his ear against the ceiling in what had become his standard intelligence-gathering posture. Voices filtered down, muffled but distinctly human. He couldn't make out words, but the tone was professional, formal. Certainly not the guttural communications he had attributed to the previous surface dwellers. "Second-wave colonizers," he muttered, scrambling for his journal to record this momentous development. More organized than the first group, possibly government or military. Above ground, Barbara Fletcher was leading what she hoped would be the last showing of 47 Maple Drive. After Trevor Williams had fired her, listed with another agency, failed to sell the half-renovated property, and finally returned to her with his tail between his legs and desperation in his eyes, she had agreed to take the listing again, at a higher commission rate, naturally. "As you can see," she was saying to the middle-aged couple following her through the living room, the previous owner completed many of the major renovations, hardwood floors throughout the main level, updated kitchen with stainless steel appliances, new windows. She strategically avoided mentioning the dining room's subfloor situation by steering them quickly toward the kitchen, a tactic she had perfected over dozens of showings. "The home inspection noted some electrical quirks in the basement," said the husband, whose careful review of the disclosure forms had made Barbara mentally reduce her chance of a sale by at least 30%. "Can we take a look at that?" Barbara maintained her professional smile with the determination of someone who has just bitten into a lemon but is pretending it's an orange. "Of course. The basement has tremendous potential as a recreation space or home office." As they descended the stairs, Barbara launched into her carefully rehearsed explanation of the basement's unique features, a real estate euphemism that ranked just below cozy tiny and just above vintage charm, falling apart in the lexicon of property misdirection. "The previous owner began some custom work down here," she explained, gesturing vaguely at the storage shelves built against the far wall. "There's an unusual circuit in the electrical panel that doesn't seem to connect to anything in the house." The inspector suggested it might have been for a workshop or specialized equipment that was removed. The husband, who had the skeptical expression of someone who had heard one too many real estate euphemisms in his lifetime, moved toward the storage shelves with the intent focus of a man about to discover something a real estate agent would prefer remained undiscovered. "These don't look like standard shelving units," he observed, running his hand along the edge where the structure met the wall. "They're built into the foundation." Barbara laughed with the slightly manic quality of someone watching a commission check dissolve before her eyes. Many homes of this era have custom storage solutions. Now, shall we look at the backyard? The Japanese maple is simply stunning in the spring. In his bunker, Herb was pressed against the wall adjacent to his concealed entrance, listening to the voices that seemed to be getting dangerously close to his sanctuary. He clutched his weapon of choice, a fire extinguisher that he had decorated with electrical tape to make it look more intimidating, a modification that would have been more effective if anyone but Herb ever saw it. "They're examining the entrance," he whispered to Spaulding, who had been positioned as a lookout despite having neither mobility nor sensory organs. This could be it. First contact. The voices above grew louder, then fainter, then disappeared altogether as the group moved to another part of the house. Herb released a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, his heart pounding with the adrenaline rush of a near discovery. Reconnaissance, he decided, making notes in his journal with a hand that trembled slightly. They're assessing the territory before establishing their base. But why here? What's special about this location? The answer, which would have been obvious to anyone not living in an apocalypse, fantasy for the past 2 years, that the house was for sale and people were viewing it, remained elusive to Herb, whose reality had long since diverged from the mundane world of real estate transactions and renovation budgets. Over the next several weeks, these visitations became more frequent. Different voices, different footsteps, but always the same pattern: arrival, movement throughout, the space above, occasional approaches to his hidden entrance, and then departure. Each time, Herb documented the event with increasing detail, developing elaborate theories about the purpose of these expeditions. His favorite theory, which he explained at length to his council of advisors, was that the surface had become divided into territories controlled by different factions, and these visits represented diplomatic missions or trading parties. "They're negotiating for resources," he informed Spaulding, who continued to smile. His permanent marker smile with what Herb interpreted as skeptical encouragement. Water, food, medicine, the basics of post-collapse economy. The toaster, which Herb had positioned on the council table as the voice of technological expertise, remained silent on the matter, having apparently decided that bread launching was its only form of communication. That night, as Herb updated his increasingly elaborate wall chart tracking surface activities, he found himself wondering what these new colonizers looked like. Were they like the previous occupants? More evolved? Less? Did they wear uniforms or insignia that might identify their faction? The curiosity was almost painful, a physical sensation that gnawed at him alongside the loneliness that he had mostly learned to ignore. For the first time in many months, Herb found himself seriously considering the possibility of venturing to the surface. Not to leave his bunker permanently, but just to peek, to see with his own eyes what the world had become. Maybe soon, he whispered to himself. A promise or a threat, he wasn't entirely sure which. Maybe soon. Chapter 8. January 10th, 2028. The power struggle. The first sign that something was catastrophically wrong with Herb's carefully maintained underground ecosystem came at precisely 3:17 a.m., when the air filtration system emitted a sound, reminiscent of a cat attempting to cough up something it should never have swallowed in the first place, followed by a series of increasingly distressed mechanical whines, and finally, silence. Herb, who had developed the light sleeping habits of prey animals and new parents, was instantly awake, his heart pounding with the particular terror reserved for those who rely on machinery to keep them alive. He fumbled for his emergency flashlight, illuminating the bunker with its harsh beam just in time to see the main lights flicker, dim, and then surrender to darkness with a finality that suggested serious electrical issues rather than a momentary power fluctuation. "No, no, no," Herb muttered, scrambling toward his control panel with the practiced movements of someone who has rehearsed this particular emergency countless times. The backup generator should have kicked in automatically, but the panel remained dark, its various gauges and indicators as lifeless as the ficus had been for the past several years. This was not supposed to happen. His systems had redundancies, and those redundancies had redundancies. The solar panels fed the main batteries, which powered essential systems and charged the backup batteries, which were connected to the generator that should activate if both primary power sources failed. For everything to fail simultaneously suggested not a random malfunction, but deliberate interference. "They've found us," Herb whispered to Spaulding, who sat on a nearby shelf, his permanent marker. Features impossible to discern in the darkness, but presumably as unconcerned as ever. "The surface dwellers have discovered the bunker, and they're cutting off our systems one by one." Above ground, Melissa Chen was having what she considered to be a perfectly reasonable conversation with her electrician about the bizarre wiring situation in her newly purchased home. "So you're telling me," she said, following Javier Rodriguez through the basement, with a flashlight, "that there's an entire circuit that goes nowhere?" "Not nowhere," Javier corrected, pointing to a section of wall behind the built-in shelving unit. "It goes somewhere, but somewhere we can't see. Behind this wall, and it's drawing a lot of power, has been for years, according to the meter history I pulled." Melissa frowned, shining her light along the seam where the shelving met the wall. She had purchased 47 Maple Drive 3 weeks earlier, attracted by its location and the renovations the previous owner had completed, despite her real estate agent's nervous laughter whenever the basement was mentioned. As a software developer who specialized in finding and fixing bugs that other programmers had created and then conveniently forgotten to document, Melissa was professionally incapable of ignoring mysteries, particularly those that were costing her money. "Can we turn it off, whatever it is?" Javier nodded. "Already did. Disconnected it at the panel before turning on power to the rest of the house. Standard procedure when we find something we can't identify. But I'm curious what's back there. These shelves don't look like they were meant to be moved, but they're not actually part of the foundation." Melissa ran her hand along the edge of the shelving unit, her fingers detecting a slight gap that shouldn't exist if this were truly built into the wall. "It almost feels like..." She pushed experimentally, and to her surprise the entire unit shifted slightly, accompanied by a mechanical click that seemed extraordinarily loud in the quiet basement. Javier raised his eyebrows. "That's not normal shelf behavior." "No," Melissa agreed, pushing again with more force. "It's not." In his bunker, Herb was implementing what he grandly termed his final contingency protocol, which primarily involved stuffing essential supplies into a backpack while whispering urgent instructions to Spaulding, who continued to be a volleyball with a face drawn on it, rather than the loyal companion Herb's isolation-addled mind had increasingly cast him as. "We need to be ready to evacuate," Herb explained, shoving a first aid kit into the already overstuffed bag. "If they've found the power systems, they'll find the entrance next. We need to be prepared for anything: negotiation, evasion, or conflict." The emergency lights, operating on their own small battery supply, provided just enough illumination for Herb to see what he was doing, but they wouldn't last more than a few hours. After that, he would be in complete darkness, with air that would grow increasingly stale as the filtration system remained offline. The thought sent a spike of panic through him that he fought to control. Panic was the enemy of survival, as he had written in his journal approximately 347 times over the past 8 years. 8 years. The realization hit him with unexpected force. He had been in this bunker for 8 years. What had started as a 2-week test run had stretched into a significant portion of his life. What would he find if he were forced to the surface now? How much had the world changed? Would he even recognize it? These philosophical musings were abruptly interrupted by a sound that Herb had both dreaded and, in some secret corner of his mind, longed for: metal scraping against metal, coming from the direction of his concealed entrance. "They've found it," he whispered, his voice barely audible even in the silence of the bunker. "They're coming in." Herb grabbed his fire extinguisher weapon and positioned himself against the wall adjacent to the entrance, heart pounding so loudly he was certain it would give away his position. Spaulding remained on the shelf, smiling his permanent marker smile at whatever fate was about to befall them. The entrance mechanism groaned in protest after years of disuse, but slowly, inevitably, the hidden door began to slide open, allowing a shaft of blindingly bright light to penetrate the darkness of Herb's sanctuary. And then, silhouetted in that light, a figure appeared. Not the radiation-mutated, monster or hazmat-suited government agent Herb had imagined, but a woman of average height with a flashlight in one hand and a perplexed expression that became visible as Herb's eyes adjusted to the light. "What the hell?" the figure said, in the tone of someone who has just discovered something significantly more unusual than they had anticipated. "There's a whole room down here, and... is that a person?" Herb, who had prepared countless speeches for this moment, ranging from formal surrender declarations to inspiring resistance manifestos, found himself capable of producing only a single, somewhat anticlimactic response. "Spaulding," he said, gesturing weakly toward the volleyball, "is actually over there."